The world of AI development is really an incredible thing. We have these super powerful machines that can literally write software for us. But here's the thing. Integrating actual AI systems into your application is a beast of a challenge. Now, in part one of this series, we built an app from scratch using Claude Code. All the way from random, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had an app that did XYZ? All the way through to a pretty functional MVP. And bonus points because it was not a to-do list. Now, the only issue is that we didn't really put any flashy AI features in there. It was a basic image uploading and processing pipeline that did some basic stuff with OpenAI. So in this video, we are going deep into things like vector databases, agentic RAG, and prompt engineering best practices so that we can take this from a simple tool to something that actually learns from its users using AI. These are the types of features that will separate apps that no one is using from apps that everyone is using. So by the end of this video, you will know how to add a legitimate AI brain to any application that you have. The kind of feature that turns a one download from the App Store from your mom pity party into a 10K per month MRR SaaS. So in case you didn't watch the last video, let's give you a super quick rundown. So this is an AI-powered cooking app. The way that it works is that the user can upload an image, right? So they can take a photo, they can whip out their camera, take a photo, or they can upload an image from their library. And from this image, they can create a Michelin star, quote unquote, home recipe, right? And so this is meant to solve the problem where you're out in public, you have this delicious meal, then you want to go try to cook that thing at home and you just have zero context for how you would do that. So we start with that uploaded image and we give it a title. So in this specific one, it's a fish John Dory with a seaweed beurre blanc. And then we have this section where we can enter in details from the restaurant's menu. So how did the restaurant actually describe this dish to the person on the menu? And so maybe it said something like, it brings together the delicate flavors of the ocean with a rich buttery sauce enhanced by the umami depth of the seaweed. So we'll say not very sweet, kind of salty, not very spicy, a lot of umami depth, right? And then we can go through and say continue. If we have any sort of dietary considerations, we can come in here and say it's got to be, pescatarian because it's a fish dish. Actually, we might not be able to do the beurre blanc if we do that. So I'm going to just take that off and then say generate recipe. And then this thing is going to go off. And what it's doing is it uploads the photo to Cloudinary as a image processing system. And then what happens is it uses OpenAI's multimodal image capabilities to understand what are the actual ingredients within the dish itself. And then based on that, it sends it off to actually generate a recipe from that list of ingredients. And then from there, what we're going to do is we're going to start adding in a lot of these agentic AI systems where we can have an actual chat back and forth. We're going to infuse a lot of these different views with AI-enabled features and really cool stuff like that. So that's what we're going to be doing in the video. This is the context for the app that we're going to be working on. So we want to make this like an AI-enabled at-home cooking companion. That is the intent behind this thing. So the first thing that I want to do as I kick this off is go through and I want to understand what were our original product specifications, like the user journey that we were originally intending to build, which again, we went through in the last video. And based on that, how well did we meet those requirements? I want to have an understanding based on all the refinements that we made and little new features we added and changes we made, where does it exist right now? And so I have this prompt where we are going through and we're saying, hey, I want you to look at everything we've built so far. I want you to reference our original project specifications that we had inside of our project documentation. So everything that we have in here that, again, we went through in the last video. So based on everything we were intending to build versus what we did build, I want you to tell me basically where we are at. And I want you to note that the AI features haven't been built yet. Okay, so don't hold that against me. We are intending to build that in this video. And so it went through and did exactly that. And so if we were to go look at the output that we got from this prompt, it is basically going through and telling us, hey, here's where you are, right? So this feature was fully implemented. So it's going to go through and tell us all the ones that were fully implemented. Our user registration, our onboarding, our app navigation is in place. The ability to actually create the recipe and take the photo and do all that is in place. The menu description section where it can take that additional context and pass it to the system, that's all in place. And then we have some things that were only partially implemented, like the ability to fully customize a taste profile. And so we're going on and on and on to really understand like what is the current state of what we have right now inside of our app. So we have our different dashboards, and then obviously we get down to all the stuff that we wanted to build with AI, and that was what the intention was for this video. So we didn't actually build any of this stuff outside of the very basic, like it hits OpenAI and says, give me a recipe based on this thing. So the reason I did that as a first step is, again, I don't want to go build all these AI features out based on an outdated version of the documentation of this tool. So that is the reason why I did that step. And so now what we're going to do is we are telling it, hey, we are going to work on this final kind of component of the app, which are these AI chat-based functionalities. And so there's a few things specifically that we want to think about. Number one is going to be our vector database storage, meaning like how are we storing our stuff in an AI kind of readable, quote unquote, format where it can retrieve things that have like a semantic relevance to what the person is searching for, not necessarily that like a keyword matches, but more that like a concept matches. So how are we going to store that information? And then I'm giving it some ideas of things that I know we're going to need to store, like recipe knowledge and conversation knowledge and things that maybe the user has learned across different recipes that we want the system to be aware of every time we say something, kind of like how ChatGPT knows if you like for it to talk to you like a bro or more professional or more funny or like whatever it might be, it kind of adapts to you, kind of a similar thing. Then in this concept of like AI functionality, there's this idea of data chunking. So we can't just store these huge mass bodies of information. Ideally, we don't want to store those things in one database like row. We want to make sure that we are chunking our data, which basically means we want to make sure we're breaking it up so that the AI can query that stuff and it makes sense. So for example, we might want to break up like a recipe into the ingredients for the recipe versus the steps for the recipe versus the user's notes that they had for like how they were tasting that recipe, so that we can query those things differently. So if I'm asking the AI, what were my tasting notes for the fish recipe I ate last week, it knows what to go look for, okay? So that's the intent behind data chunking. How are we then going to retrieve that information in the app? Like what are the different hook-in points where we would actually want to retrieve that information and use it in something? Once we are retrieving it, how are we going to pass it intelligently into our language model prompts? So for example, if I say like, hey, I need to make this recipe work for 12 people, how is it going to make those decisions or guide you along in that process? Okay, implicit user preferences, like do you always rate a certain thing a certain way? Like maybe every time you cook Italian food, you're rating it a 3. And so it's understanding that it needs to make differences in how it gives you recommendations. And then how do we manage the memory of this thing over time, right? We're going to have eventually like a lot of old conversations. You probably don't want to retain the entire conversation thread if it was very long. Maybe you just want to have summaries of those things. Like how are we going to manage all of that? And then last but not least is the prompt engineering side of things. So how are we going to have like mode-specific prompts, for example, if I'm in experimentation mode versus like active cooking mode? What are the different prompts that I would pass to the system so that it knows how to respond to me? Because if I'm in the experimentation mode, I might say it's okay to experiment with things. But if I'm in the active cooking mode, then being like terse and to the point and giving very specific directions that have a high degree of like fidelity to the original recipe can be really important. So we're going to work on how we do that across a few different domains, and we'll get into all of this. They will each have their own section in this video. So last thing that I'm doing here is I'm saying what vector database I want to use. So I'm going to use Supabase's built-in pgvector for the database. Okay. I'm telling it where I want it to put its output in this folder. And then I'm giving it a little bit of a persona prompt. So say like you are a CEO or a head of product, and I want you to look at these docs. And the first thing I want to do, I'm not going to say just, and go build me AI features. I'm going to say brainstorm features based on all of this stuff that we have. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through it. I'm going to look through it and decide what I want to actually build based on the scope of this thing. Again, this is meant to be an MVP, but I'm also trying to show you guys stuff that I think is cool when I get to it. And so it's a little bit straddling this line between like, hey, is that really an MVP? Like you're really going to build that now, but I'm trying to show you guys these things. So I'm giving it the initial high-level app idea, which was like a very brief summary. I'll show it to you guys of what I wanted to build. Like this was super basic thing that I had in there. So passing that in so it has it for context. I'm passing in the original product requirements that we had. So this came from our product manager agent. Then the initial user journey that we had, and then what's been implemented so far. So this is the one that we just did as an update. And this is why I did it, so that it has the context of what was initially planned versus what is actually implemented. So we can understand what the gaps are between those things. And it doesn't try to go build a feature that is now based on something that ended up not being built in the specific way that I had initially planned for it to be. And then I provide this last little bit of detail. So a detail-oriented exercise, I want you to look at what's been implemented so far and think through how we can build AI features into each feature. It could be as simple as, a little button next to an ingredient that says, hey, substitute this ingredient. It could be something as simple as that, or as advanced as like a full-fledged agentic RAG system that's a live cooking companion and is talking to me in real time with like AI in it, right? So brainstorm all of this stuff. And then I want you to structure your outputs based on the screen. And I'm a very visual person. And so when I look at these things, I like to think, okay, if I'm on, this cookbook screen and I cook into one of these recipes, like what is it going to show me on this screen, right? Like where does it think AI could fit into this screen? And so we'll go back and forth with those, but let's go look at what that output looks like. So here we are. It goes screen by screen and tells us what it thinks should be in there. So for the My Kitchen, so again, they're talking about for this main homepage, what does it think should be there? So this is kind of like an intelligent, smart daily suggestion feature, a predictive streak. So it kind of understands if you're maybe not about to cook something and nudges you. I don't really like that, so I won't do that. This one's kind of cool, where it's kind of like gamifying the like growth path for somebody, where it's like, hey, dude, like you've made a lot of pasta. Like maybe you're ready to make your own pasta, right? That's kind of cool. So I like how it's done that. And then smart recipe recommendations, right? So like based on, you did this carbonara really well. Maybe you want to try, I will butcher this if I try to pronounce it, cacio e pepe. Maybe that's what you want to try next, right? And so I like these two, but let's keep going through and seeing what else we have in here. So for the photo capture, now the photo capture is the one where I know what would be really cool, but I'm not interested in trying to build that right now. So what it wants to do is all of these features around like real-time dish detection. So for example, if I'm like pointing the camera at a dish, it will say something like, you need to move closer, you need better lighting, you actually have two dishes in the view, and you need to just focus on the one, right? Or real-time like ingredient analysis, where it's like, hey, it looks like there's capers in there, stuff like that. That's just really cool, but the idea of having to deploy an on-device machine learning model definitely doesn't seem MVP for this thing. And so I think a lot of these camera photo storing things, I will probably not include any of these. I think the camera uploading functionality that we have here is fine for what the app does, right? Where we go through this whole flow and do everything. So I'm not going to worry about that right now. So then we get down to like our menu description and like the extra context. And so this is referring to this screen here where we've now, picked something. We say it looks good. And then we're getting into this, right? That flow where it's like, okay, like describe the dish now. How sweet was it? How did it taste? All of that. This is what it's saying. And so one thing that I think is really cool is if we could take a picture of something and it actually extracts the text off the menu for that item. I do think that would be really cool, but again, I think it's beyond the scope of an MVP. I don't really think the context-aware suggestions is super valuable, where, you point the camera at it and it's like, it looks like risotto. This is what might be in it. That doesn't provide value for the user for this type of thing. Same thing with the cuisine auto detection. Like, it's like, okay, whatever. And then I thought this one was cool. So if you're in this like initial uploading process, and you didn't give it context for something. So maybe, for example, in this slider that we have, sweet is at a default of 5. Maybe all of them start at a default of 5, and you didn't change one, but it expects that you should have based on the description, right? So for the John Dory fish thing, if they're all starting at a 3 and it describes it as umami craziness, and it's like, well, you didn't say it was umami craziness though, so what was it? Like having that ability. That sounds pretty cool. I like the idea of that. So when we scroll down to the experiment mode, now what it's referring to for the experiment mode, if we go back, is when I'm in one of these. So it just loaded the recipe. This is what we're considering the experiment mode. And I'm looking at the different like flavor profiles for this thing and the kitchen requirements, what I'm going to need, all of that type of stuff. Like what happens in this screen. This is what it's referring to. This experiment success prediction, I really don't like this. And it kind of does this already in the app where it's like, oh, 70% like likelihood of success. They have that down here somewhere too, where it's like, oh, like 70%. So first of all, it's always a 70% chance, but it's like, I don't want to tell the person that this thing might fail because people are very loss oriented. So like, I don't think that's the best way to position this type of thing. So I'm definitely not going to do that. And I might actually change that. I do like this idea for like a general smart feature where it's like, hey, like you want to try something cool? Like we could try to do this carbonara, but like have it inspired by like Asian food or something. I think that could be really cool. So I like that smart experiment idea. And then failure recovery. So if like I'm a user and I'm trying to cook this thing and like the sauce breaks or something doesn't look the way that it's described as it should look, being able to take a photo of it and upload it to the system and have the system learn what actually happened. And then can you use that again with this concept of like agentic RAG retrieval when it goes to then make a new recipe. Maybe we have like a vector store that's all past failures and what happened, right? And the user seems to break sauce all the time. So like next time we do this, we need to have a specialized section that are like warnings and how to not have them break the sauce when they try to do it. So those are like the types of features that are in my mind for this thing, just so you guys have context for what it is we are trying to do here. So cookbook mode, I like this like kind of NL, like natural language searching, right? So I could go into, again, the cookbook section, and if I'm in the mood for something, instead of saying surprise me, maybe I could like describe it, right? So I could say like, I want something like that's Italian, but is also like really salty because I feel like I need that right now. And then also has this thing and, oh, this is what I have in the kitchen. And it can go out, again, use the semantic retrieval, like the conceptual retrieval from the database of all of those different things in the tags, right? Italian and salty and all of that. And use that to generate you a recipe that actually like conforms to this command that you had. So I think this is really cool, really cool. Adaptive difficulty scaling where it's like, hey, this is a beginner recipe. And it's like, hey, can you make this more advanced, for example? And then again, I like this like recipe fusion kind of thing. So that's it for like the features that are already there. And then we have this like, okay, what's the general chat going to be about though? Like what is this feature going to be? And so if we go through and we look at what we have, here are a few ideas that it has for this system specifically. So first thing, like, hey, I'm cooking this recipe from my cookbook, like, and I need to ask you questions about it. Okay, so like that kind of intelligent querying of what it is that I am doing right now in the app. So if I was in the cookbook and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go cook the mussels, right? And I'm in here, and then I hop over into this conversational chef to be able to say like, hey, I'm cooking this specific thing from my cookbook library, and this is my question. So I think that's pretty cool. And then like keeping the contextual awareness, probably having the chat history in there would be cool too. A real-time image analysis, pretty cool. Proactive timer. I don't really want to deal with like it's now telling you like when to do a specific thing, like put the salt in now. Like I think there's too much that could go wrong on the user side for that. So I don't really want to do that. Technique generation. This could be cool for like a down the road, like e-learning kind of feature in there. I'm not going to do that right now. And then an easy substitution wizard. So basically what I did was I went through all of those and I pulled through the ones that I want to actually work on. So all of these features here are the ones that in this video we are going to work on implementing. So we have some for pretty much everything except, again, that photo upload. We have something for each of those. And so that is what we are going to work on right now. All right, guys, so a little bit of pre-work. We jumped onto a new feature branch for all of this testing because, again, I have a functional app and I don't want this to go out and start breaking a bunch of shit. So we have this new feature branch called AI Chat, and I'm going to input this prompt and then we'll look at it and chat about it. So basically, very similar to that first prompt where we say, hey, we're going to be building this AI Chat feature. It has all of these sections that you need to consider, from the vector database storing to the data chunking, the retrieval, injecting it into our prompts, our prompt engineering, how we're going to manage the memory of this thing. And then what we're saying is that we want it to invoke the system architecture agent. So you'll remember this is the agent we used back in the last project if you watched that video. If not, you can go watch it and see how this thing works. I've done 2 videos now that talk about this agent specifically, but it is meant to understand the requirements of the project and the tech of what we are trying to build. And it uses that to build a comprehensive architecture, like system documentation, basically. So we're saying invoke that agent. to create me an updated system architecture document based on what we're talking about above. So based on the fact that I want to start using a vector database and have a chunking strategy and, do all these different things, like how is that going to influence our architecture, right? Because now we're adding on like pretty significant new functionality. And so we need to make sure that works with everything that we already have. And so what we are passing in is that list of feature documentation that we just came up with. So we went through and said, hey, these are the features that we are planning to integrate. I want you to take this into account and update that system architecture documentation. So that's going to be the first step on this journey, because we want to understand how this is going to impact our tech choices, how we've already configured like our backend APIs and the GraphQL that we have set up, and like all of that stuff. We want to make sure that that system, the Redis queues, everything will work with what we are intending to build now. So we want to marry those two worlds together. That's the intention behind this stage. After we're done with this and we're cool with what that architecture document looks like, we're going to move on to the UX UI engineer for this specific set of features. All right, guys, so here we have our updated system architecture. We'll just read through it live. I haven't looked at this yet, so we're just going to experience it together. So a database, Supabase, PostgreSQL. Okay, so pgvector is what it is going to use for all the vector operations on this thing, which is cool. We already have OpenAI integrated, so shouldn't be too much that needs to be done with that. Again, vector database, already have that in there. So there's honestly, I think the only architectural change is going to be that we are just enabling this pgvector thing, and that's what we're going to use for our database, vector database operations. Technical considerations. So we've updated like some of the, I guess you could call them like an SLA, or like what's the timing or like main requirements that the user would like, or the app needs to conform to. So for example, we've added in this chat feature. So we need to make sure we have less than 3 seconds for a chat response. Someone shouldn't be sitting there for 10 seconds waiting. Okay, we can keep scrolling and scrolling. So again, nothing's really changing in our tech stack for this, which is pretty nice. Let's go down and look at the architecture. So the only thing that's really changing is we have some different workers now, right? So we have like these embedding workers that again would be like processing jobs in the background. And then we have some different API endpoints that we're going to be adding in to be able to maintain this stuff. But outside of that, again, most of this is already in place. So some other like important changes. I'm not sure that we have this in place right now, but rate limiting token usage so that someone doesn't just like blow our API out of the water and then we're stuck with a huge bill. So a few little tiny changes to like our backend dependencies to specify certain things that we're using. Front end, nothing is really being updated. So we're not going to go through all of this stuff in the video. Well, we will talk about this stuff more inside of the course. So by the way, for anyone watching, inside of the free course that we have little add-on videos that don't go up to YouTube that just explain a little bit more of the stuff between the lines with some of these things when we make just like tiny small changes to things. So if you want to see that, you can, but it's not critical. So got to update some of our environment variables, like our Docker configurations, all of that type of stuff. All right, guys. So last thing I'm doing here is I'm using the linear MCP, so project management MCP, to clean up this, like the features that we went through that I said like I really want to do in this. I want to make sure this is scoped to an MVP. So it was like a list of 13 features, and that's just going to be too much to do. So I'm going to narrow this thing down. And so I went through here and a bunch of these features that we had in that list, I said, move this to the backlog using the linear MCP. So it's going to go through and do that. And then from there, we'll be good to start implementing our UX UI engineer. All right, guys, so that is cleaned up. All that stuff's pulled out to linear. And now we are running through and running this UX engineering agent. Okay. And so this prompt is largely the same as the one we used before, where we're giving a little bit of context about how you need to consider these things, like relative to where they're documented in this system architecture and everything, because the database and like the backend rather, and what we're able to expose from API endpoints and all of that type of stuff, that's really going to end up informing like what do you have access to on the front end, and therefore like the user experience needs to be developed from the perspective of knowing how the system actually works. And so that is why we have in here these sections saying like be like contextually aware of the fact that there's going to be, all these different things going on. We tell it where to output the response, because this is going to be like a markdown file that we get as a response. And then we're telling it, invoke the UX UI designer. I want you to look at the originally intended AI features, which are what these are from our original documentation that we had. And then I want you to look at the new features that we're designing, which are the ones that I just pulled out all those other ones from to put into the linear project management system. So we have a backlog of stuff. We're saying these are the current user journeys. These were the old user journeys, just for some additional context. And then here's our technical architecture. And so we're basically saying you need to work on building out this full UX UI plan specifically for the AI chat agent, and then each of the features that we have in this kind of feature backlog that we're mentioning right here. So it's going to go through, it's going to do all that stuff. It's invoked the agent, and then we will see the output that we get. All right, guys, so this agent just finished running through for us, and it basically gave us a breakdown of all of those features, but obviously it goes a little bit more in depth for each of them. So just scrolling through, and maybe we'll pop out and look at a few specific examples. So it's breaking down like different states. What does it look like, for example, when the AI is chatting to somebody? Like, what does that kind of look like? The typing indicators. What are the different types of chat modes and contexts we can have? So for example, if I'm in like an active cooking mode, which we talked about, what is the type of context that it loads into that, into that environment? It would pull things like the recipe steps, the ingredients, the progress, the user skill level. All of these types of things are going to get integrated into like the responses that are being sent and received. And so I already pruned through this whole thing, so it's pretty good to go. I just want to show you guys like kind of what type of output this looks like, where we're going through again, like what is the feature, and then what is the context that's being pulled in, and then what does it kind of look like? So what are some like initial ideas or inspiration for the UI? And then as we scroll down and down and down, so it continues doing this for all of our features that we've outlined. And then we eventually get into the actual like screen by screen specification. So for example, if we're in like the chat, like the main chat area, what does the layout of it look like? How is it actually like structured? What does, the header look like? What are the different visual specifications? So here's like the header styling, what it looks like if there's no chat in there, like a welcome state, like a fresh blank slate. What is the quick action grid that we're going to have? And what's the styling of the different options that we have in there? What does it look like when we're looking at recent conversations? And so what does it look like when we're interacting with it? Like what if I tap on the quick action, right? Like what is the animation? What's the haptic feedback look like? All of those sorts of things are going to be super important for us. What does the state look like when it's empty, when it's loading, when it's erroring? If you're offline, can it work offline? So for every single screen, again, and like the different states of those screens, we're going through and doing that same thing, like visual specifications, the layout, all the different ways a user can interact with it and how it responds in those situations. So we're doing that this whole way for every single feature that we have, that same exact process. After that, we get down to the visual design system, meaning like what does the color palette look like? What are the actual like specifications of doing different animations and things like that? So for example, what are the colors of the AI assistant? What is the typography for the AI assistant? What does the spacing look like inside of that screen? And then we have examples of what these components would actually look like, practically speaking. So we have some examples that go in here. I don't know why this decided to do Swift when it's a React Native app. Kind of weird, but hopefully it doesn't cause a problem for us as we move through this. So again, for every like major component, it's going through and doing that. And then we get into like animation guidelines, right? So if you're going to be, easing in or easing out, like what does that actually need to look like, for how long, right? How long does it take for the animation to actually complete what it's doing? How can we optimize for those things? And on the third video, so the next video after this one, we're anyway going to go through and do a lot of UX UI polishing and cleanup. So I'm not super concerned about like exactly what happens with some of the animations that it does, but we want to at least have it pointed in the right direction. So basically what we're going to do from here, we're going to pop our good old-fashioned console back open, and we are going to kick this thing off. So the first thing that we're going to do is check our Git repository, and I just want to make sure that we have these plans committed. Okay, so now we know where we are. We have that committed in case we ever need to roll back to it. So this is what our prompt is going to be. So we want you to invoke the backend engineering agent, because again, We're going to build the back end first, and then we're going to hook in the actual front end to it. So invoke the backend engineer agent to build out the AI chat screen functionality. I want you to look specifically at these files, so the kind of user experience that we're going for and the overall system architecture. Again, we're focusing specifically on the AI chat screen, so make sure not to go implementing other stuff. I want you to think about all of these areas, the vector database, how we're going to chunk the data, the memory management over time, managing like contextual awareness, and then the overall prompt engineering for how the messages are going to flow back and forth. Output of the stage should be a fully functional AI chef chat screen. So this screen right here, I want to be fully functional by the time we're done with this. And then I want you to document everything in a markdown for this feature. So we're going to let this thing run, and then we'll look at what that output looks like. All right, guys, this thing just ran through for us. So we're going to go check out the documentation of what it said it built. All right, so we have, first up, it has this section on key capabilities. So intelligent conversation modes. So it has modes for, actively cooking, experimenting with something, learning about something, and then planning. So 4 different kind of intelligence modes. That's obviously going to impact how we do our prompt engineering and things like that. So good to know that we have these different mode systems in place. A vector database, we know that. I'm not super knowledgeable, to be honest, of the difference in the dimensions of the embedding. So this is something I'd probably do some deep research on to understand better, which I will do. Context-aware responses, so automatic context loading from current recipe. Going to need to make sure we understand what that means. Like, what does it mean by current recipe? What if someone has, 5 recipes that are technically active in the system? Hopefully it's not pulling all of those through. So we'll need to get clear on that one when we get down to building things. Memory management. So it's storing the last 10 messages at any point in time. After 30 messages, it does like a compression and summarizes. So similar to how like the compact feature works inside of Claude Code. A long-term archival for learning extraction, and then a hierarchical storage pattern, which is cool. So from there, it just breaks down for us what the actual interaction of all this is going to look like as far as the backend goes. So you have workers that generate the embeddings. We have already this real-time WebSocket thing set up. So an embedding chat, an embedding function or endpoint within the chat service. And then same thing for the chat service, that's fine. So how does the data flow between all of this? So a mobile app is going to send a message to the backend system, then loads relevant context. It retrieves relevant knowledge from the vector embeddings. Okay, makes sense so far. Based on that, it constructs a prompt that actually has this relevant information in it, then sends it to OpenAI to generate the response. Message gets sent back via the WebSocket or GraphQL, and then the conversation is stored and indexed. So, data flow makes a lot of sense to me, so that's nice. Okay, then it's starting to get into like what the actual schema looks like in the database, like what's the table going to look like for the recipe embeddings, for the conversation embeddings, for the AI chat service. This is on the Python side. What is that? Like, how is the initialization of that going to look? And this is all built already, by the way, in the backend. This is just it documenting to me what it built and how what it built works, by the way. So important to note that this is all built already. Okay, it's breaking down for me the different functions that it created and what they do, how it's going to manage memory. So it's an active conversation if it's 0 to 7 days from the time it was created. I'm assuming that's based on create time. We need to check that. Then it gets compressed and summarized, and then it gets archived. So that's pretty reasonable, I'd say. Okay, and then where is that data going to live depending on, is it a hot tier, a warm tier, or a cold tier? What do the different cooking mode prompts look like? You're a real-time cooking assistant. You're in the current stage of this recipe, which has this many steps. Okay, provide immediate practical help. And then here's the user question. Okay, makes sense. Similar query for the experimentation mode. These types of things, once we have like data flowing around and we're seeing the outputs, we'll probably go through and dial a lot of this in. So not super worried about that. Here's what the backend structure looks like with these updates. Pretty cool. And then the key services. So we have our chunking service, which again, breaks that down so we can store things in the vector database properly, right? So we need to be able to search this stuff in the database, which is what chunking helps us with. Then we have this service that's going to help with the memory of the chats. So like that window maintenance, compressing things, a long-term archiving of those chats, making sure we have the context we need at any point in time. So that's all going to be managed by a specific service. Then we have the vector searching. So if a user says like, hey, what was that? What was the 5th step of that Indian recipe I made 3 weeks ago? It's going to know how to go find that. That's what this is for. Prompt context builder. So we'll have a service that's just for like building these prompts with the context that we have. And then we have a nice API reference so that we can go look and see like what is actually happening with these queries. How is it being searched? How are the mutations happening with GraphQL? All of that type of stuff is in here. So seems pretty straightforward. So what we're going to do now is we are going to kick off the front end agent. Okay. All right. So we are kicking off basically the same exact prompt for the most part, except we're invoking the front end engineer. And then I just added in the documentation for the backend. And so we have the backend documentation. That's really the one big change that we made. So we're linking like, and hey, here's the backend that's going to power this thing. And then we just said, I want you to really think through the UX design, how a user is meant to engage with the feature while understanding the structure of the data and the services that you're going to be interacting with, because at the end of the day, they power this feature. So don't go build a feature that doesn't actually have an endpoint that is going to give you the data that needs to be there for this thing to work. I don't want that to happen. So it is going out and it's doing its thing. So we'll let it ride and then we will come on back to it. All right, guys. So the front end engineering agent just finished. All right, guys, so the front-end agent just finished and gave us a pretty similar file that we had for the back-end one, but this one covers the back-end implementation and the front-end implementation in one comprehensive feature documentation. And so we can just peruse through this kind of quick, where it's highlighting a lot of the same stuff that it did for the back-end, but the difference is that now it's telling us where the front-end fits into the overall scope, the overall picture. So, for example, in the data flow, we're now tying in like the specific front-end technology into that data flow. So for example, the React Native UI captures the message, the Zoostan store handles like the updates, the data gets sent through to GraphQL, right? And then we have all these other pieces, but it's pulling in where the front end actually interacts in this scenario. And then we have this breakdown of the back-end implementation, but then the front-end implementation. So what are the different core components that we have? What does the chat store look like? What does the actual front-end chat service look like? What is the component library, right? Where have we built out like the typing indicator versus the chat input versus the messages, and all of that type of stuff now is going to be documented in this. And this is going to be super helpful because then we can go and we can reference this specific document. So we can look at what our feature requirements were, our text specifications for the app as a whole, and make sure that what it's documenting kind of lines up. And then this is also really helpful for us, again, if you're like vibe coding in particular, it's good to go through this stuff because it's like a good way to learn, right? We're not only building stuff, but then we're having it explained to us, which is obviously key to a lot of this. So really good. The next step is we're going to try to build this thing and see what we have. All right, guys. So we have this screen now that's popped out. The front end ran, the back end ran, and we have this little AI chat kind of area. It's pretty much empty so far. So there are a few things we need to fix. It doesn't have a button to really initiate a chat. I know we built all of those components. It's just not showing. We have these helpful little kind of command cards down here, like, hey, set a timer, next step, substitute. It's obviously being blocked by this. So that's something we'll need to fix. These different views are supported, where if we're in the experiment view, for example, we have different options like, hey, try a variation of this, simplify it, elevate it, right? So we have some different ideas. So we at least have like the scaffolding of it. The like backend WebSocket connection is working, which is cool. So we now need to just connect this through to everything else that we had, that actual chat functionality. All right, guys, just a quick update because I'm trying to keep this real life as far as things might be breaking and stuff. And so what are we dealing with? I'm getting this error. So changed the UI a tiny bit, made a few tweaks, but anytime we send this request to the backend, we're getting an error where it can't send the message, and it looks like it's not attaching the messages specifically is what the problem seems to be. And so we're going to go through and try to fix this. I'm just trying to get to a point where I can actually have a back and forth conversation with OpenAI And then once that's there, we will start diving into all of these other little features where we can like add context into this chat and do some quick actions and all of that type of stuff. So stand by. All right, guys, so we got past that first error that we were looking at, but now there's just a few more things failing on the back end. So there's like some functions that it's trying to call that backend agent didn't actually build, even though it's like expected in some of the like services. So we're just going through and testing this thing and seeing if there's anything else that was left out. And then from there, we should be able to send a message back and forth. All right, guys, so I want to give you a quick little update on where we are at. So we made a few changes to this screen. So I didn't like how it had those different tabs at the top. I felt like this was feeling way too cluttered. Even this UI needs to be cleaned up a little bit. We'll do that in the third video of this series. But this is where it's at now. So we implemented a really basic chat history, which obviously we need to like use the AI. We need an endpoint for updating these names properly so it doesn't just say cooking, right? And it actually says like what the chat was about. So we need to change like a few little tiny things here, but let me show you the main flow. So we can now select an item. So say, for example, this specific recipe, and then I could say something like, what are the main steps in this recipe? And then this is going to show you what it is that we're actually attempting to debug, because this is going to disappear in a second. So the system isn't like properly maintaining or managing what's a user message and what's a system message. So we can see, though, the main thing that I wanted to test is that we can, in fact, send this as context to our backend system and then receive a response that is like actually related. So it is using the context of that recipe in its responses, which is exactly what we wanted to do. And so what I'm doing now is I'm just fixing this piece where it's not maintaining like the styling properly. And so I actually have a backlog bug using the linear project management tool called Goal 55, where that's what this bug is, right? And so this is one of my kind of launch blockers in the bug board. Really good habit to get into in general is to like actually use a product management tool. But we have this in here where the chat messages are kind of getting lost in the sauce. And so we're just having this now go through and fix that problem for us. And then we'll hop back on and see where we're at in the process. All right, guys, so we fixed a few different issues that we were having. One of which was these messages, like it was treating everything like a system message. So it wasn't really remembering or showing what the user had sent. So we fixed that. We added in this nice little function where we created an API endpoint that will have OpenAI categorize or like summarize what the chat is about and create a title, right? So for example, avoiding gray rings on steak instead of just saying something generic like cooking chat, right? So now we actually can look back and see what the messages and the conversations were about. So I can click into one of these and kind of look at everything. And then obviously I can come in here and I can create a new chat and I could ask it something. So I could say like, what are some interesting variants of chimichurri? Right, I could ask it a question. It's going to go off. It's going to process for a second and then reply to us. Okay, it says red chimichurri, cilantro chimichurri, spicy. Okay, a few different ideas. And again, we're going to dial in how these prompts actually work under the hood. But then we could go in. We can now see that we have this title that's been created, exploring chimichurri variants. I can pop back to like a yogurt-based recipe chat. We have this nice little slide in, slide out animation, if you noticed that for this. So overall, AI chat functionality is working at this point. Now, I also made a change because we had this issue where every time a user clicked on this, so if I was over in like the My Kitchen, I clicked on AI Chef, it automatically created a chat in the backend. And then so if I navigated away, I would just have all of these empty chats. And so I changed the logic a little bit. Again, all just through natural language prompting to Claude. Like I wasn't saying anything too crazy, just saying like, hey, I noticed that we're creating a session every single time the user loads the screen. Can you change that so that it only happens when the first message goes through? So made a few changes like that, which is really just going to help with the quality of life of the app, and it's snappier now, it moves quicker, all of that great stuff. So one other meaningful change that we made, if we're like inside of, for example, the cookbook, and I'm like testing this John Dory with a seaweed beurre blanc, and I want to refine this with AI, it now loads this this recipe into the context. So it immediately took all of that like experiment data that we have with that dish and loads it into the chat. So now we have that and we can have a conversation with this chat specifically. So I could come in here, for example, and say like, I don't have ingredients for a miso beurre blanc. What other options do I have to fit same flavor profile, right? So I can come through, I can ask it something like that. And again, now it has the full context of all of the ingredients and all of the steps and the taste profile and all of that stuff. And it's going to give me some different options. Okay. So I could do a soy and ginger one. I could do mushroom garlic. I could do anchovy, right? Like few different options that I would have. So one last small little issue that I'm having is you'll notice when we were in here that it still says just chatting. Okay. So I clicked through from a cookbook recipe and it says just chatting, and it should be actually changing this to reflect the fact that this is in fact an experiment. Like I'm having a conversation with this recipe basically. And so it needs to update to reflect that. And so I had this in the bug board in the backlog. And so I thought this would be a good way to show like a way at least that I use Linear as a project management tool, but also via like an MCP. And so I'm going to ask it to please investigate and resolve the bug from Linear titled goal 59. And I'm going to put it in plan mode. So it's going to go out, it's going to pull that, and then it's going to come back to us. And we should have a plan of attack from there. So it looks like what's happening is that it's actually a fallback or something. So it's saying just chatting because it's not pulling through the recipe name. Therefore, it can't create this title where it says experimenting with recipe name. So we just need to fix that, and it's kind of outlining the files that need to be fixed for that. And so we're just going to let this go through. And then from there, we should be about 95% done at least with this AI chat feature. And then we'll readdress that backlog we had and everything we've built to date, get an understanding of where we are, and then get an understanding of what we want to build next. All right, guys, so this thing is pretty much working, this chat. There's only one feature, like important AI-powered feature that is missing really still from this chat. What is that feature? So if I'm in here, for example, and I'm, experimenting with this fish dish, for example, and I say, hey, I want to refine this thing with AI, and it pops me into this chat. Now, let's say I come in here and I'm like, give me some other white fish options to substitute here, right? So let's say I send a message. We're talking about this John Dory fish thing, and I'm experimenting with this specific one, but I don't have access to that fish. And it's like, okay, it's going to generate me some different opportunities. So it's thinking. And then it says, hey, there's a few different things that you could do. Now, the thing is, how do I get this back into that recipe, right? Because if this is supposed to be like an iterative experimentation type process, I need to be able to somehow get this information back into that recipe that I had, right? I need to be able to do that. So the way that I kind of think of how I would do this in my mind is like, it's kind of like a fork inside of GitHub, for example. And so we need to figure out how to like fork off of that original recipe so that we still have that if we ever need it, like that original recipe that we had. But then we can come in here and we can now like update that recipe based on wanting to change like this fish. And so we need to think through like what's the best UI experience for us to be able to do that. And so I am going to go in and I'm going to ask Claude exactly that. So I'm going to ask Claude to plan me and like think through this, exactly what we need to do. So like we have this feature in place where the user can load in the context, but the issue is we need to be able to somehow regenerate the recipe, right, with these updates. So whether that's through natural language or some other sort of UI mechanics, maybe there's like, I don't know, like a little symbol on the chat and you could say, hey, like make a change to the experiment based on this message. I don't know, something like that. We need to basically start brainstorming how we're going to sync that state through and create this new recipe variant. And again, I'm saying like, I think of it like forking off, kind of like you would in GitHub, off that old recipe variant. But I don't want to get too technical and complicated with this thing. And so I'm just asking it to help brainstorm different approaches to this problem. And so we'll come back and look at what the plan is, and then we will, oh, it's right here. And we'll decide on our plan of attack. So approach one, this is kind of what I was thinking, where there's some sort of little tiny UI button, like maybe a little AI symbol. And when you click on it, it basically indicates that they want to take something from this and integrate it into the new plan. So that could work. I think the one thing we would need to consider there, though, is in this example where we have 5 different things, how does it know which one to take, right? So there needs to be like at least some sort of review stage. So like approach number 1, but with like kind of a review stage, which they have here, but just need to think through that a little bit. With a natural language command, could get a little bit ambiguous, to be honest, and so I don't know that I love that one. Modification tracker sidebar, add a collapsible panel that tracks modifications discussed. I do like this idea of the toggle, where it almost like creates a list view of different things that could change, and you're toggling like take this through, take this through, take this through. So it could be like change the protein and change the sauce to this and make sure this all works together. So that's an option for sure. So I'm going to tell it, I like option 1 and I like option 3, but there's still some considerations, right? So I like options 1 and 3, but the thing we need to consider is how changes get applied when the AI system gave multiple options in one message. For example, with the message body below, how would the user specify which fish exactly they want to take forward? And then I'm going to go back into our UI. I don't know if I can actually, I'm going to see if I can go into the console logs actually and just find this text that was sent. Yeah, we have it right here. So I'm just going to copy this message down to here. Going to copy it. We're going to pop in, paste it in, and then we're going to see what the updated plan is. Okay, and so here's what it came back with, a few different ways we can do that. Solution 1 is basically an inline selection. And so basically it would be the case that like when they recommend something to the user that's like an ingredient or whatever it might be, it creates it so that it's like tappable inline. So it's almost like hyperlinked in a way. And then when you actually like long press on it or select it, it basically gets like checked. And so you can check, uncheck it and say like, these are the modifications that I want to pull through. And then it also has this solution 4, which is like having in some way in the UI, like a running tally or track of all of the modifications that you intend to make. So it's recommending that we combine those two. Now I'm down for that. My question is, we need to think through like, well, how does this actually happen programmatically? Like, because now the AI system needs to know that it needs to return responses, knowing that this is how we need responses in the front end in order for this feature to actually function. And so that means we're probably going to have to mess around a little bit with the structured data and like the schema of how we get responses back from the language model, so that anytime it is in like an experiment mode and it's giving a recommended recipe adjustment, that it knows it has to give recommendations in this format specifically. We'll need that for the front end to work. So that's very important. So I'm going to now go through and step this to the next stage of that planning process and say, hey, you need to think through all of these things and then let me know what your plan is. All right, guys, so just a few things I'm thinking through here. And this is, I think, important just to show this type of thing, because I think there's a lot of ambiguity in the world of vibe coding with like, people that claim you can one-shot anything, and then people that claim that you'll never build anything unless you're a software engineer. And there's obviously this middle ground. And so doesn't mean we can't think through potential conflicts, right? And prompt the system about those conflicts and like really think through how things are set up and what we think we might run into. And that's what we're doing here. So what I'm saying is I like your recommendation, but I think we really need to think through especially this AI messages piece, because it sounds like when we're in the experiment mode, we're going to need to force the schema that the LLM responds to us with anytime there's a substitution or a recommendation, right? Because the front end is going to rely on the consistency of the response, because if it's not consistent, then we're not going to be able to build that front end piece that can like see, the brackets and know that that needs to become tappable and that it does these other things. So really important that the back end is always responding with substitutions, for example, in a very specific way. And so this might have to change how we do the prompt engineering, right? We might need to change how we do our prompting and split things up into different phases. And so I want the system to think through that. And then we also need to think through, it's talking about these, modifications that can take place through natural language. Like, where does that data live? Is it going to live on the front end state? Is it going to be in the database? How does that natural language that it's saying we could use as a fallback, right? If the user says, like, let's use the halibut. Well, how are we going to, number one, store that information? Number two, not like use the language model for every single thing we could possibly want to do, because we're going to end up in a situation where we're just blowing through tokens on things that maybe there was a different way to do it that didn't rely on the LLM. So we want to think through those things. And then once the user is cool with modifications, okay, well, we need to be able to regenerate the recipe, right? Do we want to indicate in the UI that this was actually forked off of like this recipe? Like, do we want to show that in any way to the user? Or we just show as like another experiment, So like, what do we want to do with that? And then the last thing, which is really important to keep in mind, is this is meant to be an app that helps people cook well. So what if they pick a bunch of substitutions that are actually stupid and don't make sense together? That would be bad, right? If they say we start with this John Dory thing, and next thing you know, they want to put, some fish in there, like swordfish that has a very particular taste, and then they change out for the sauce, and it's like, this is just entirely different thing, and these things that you've chosen to substitute don't make sense together. So we need to have some sort of like intelligence behind there that takes their substitutions, looks at the original recipe, and then gives the user actual feedback on this thing. So I think those are all really important things to consider before we go and make a change. And so I'm going to have it go out and do a plan based on this, and then we will see what it thinks about everything. All right, guys. And this is part of why I love this stuff. This is like awesome that we can do something like this. As long as we take the time to like think through things in a little bit more depth, we can really leverage the shit out of these types of tools. So I love it. So let's look through the type of response that we got based on what we asked, okay? And so number one, for this concept of like these structured LLM responses, this is what it is thinking about. So when the mode is experimenting, okay, so when we're in an experimentation chat, it's going to have this like generating a structured response function. And so we can look at what this prompt looks like and what it chose to do, right? So if we're working with a natural language type of explanation of something, what are the different modifications, right? So we'll have this array of modifications that come through, and then every modification needs to have a type. Is it a substitution? Is it an adjustment? Is it an addition? Or is it a removal? And then what is the category? Are we substituting, adjusting, adding, or removing ingredients, techniques to the process, temperatures, time, right? There's different things that could be getting changed. And then what are the different options of that change, right? So if we're substituting an ingredient, we could have halibut, we could have salmon, right? We could have all these different things. And then what's their reasoning, which is fine. This will probably be used in the response. And then the compatibility score with the original recipe. Now, I think that is really cool. And again, the reason that it even suggested this to us as something to put in the schema is because we asked about this up here, where we said, what if the substitutions don't work well together? And now it's thinking through the schema of the responses and saying, okay, well, we can have this compatibility score, right? And now we might be able to just use an overall compatibility scoring algorithm instead of needing to go out and just ask the language model, like, is this compatible, right? So that's pretty cool that we can do that. So that's like the first major change. Then it created this storage system for the modification tracker. Okay, so pending modifications, selected modifications, and then validated modifications, and how it's going to store all of that. So it is going to have a backend table. So we're going to create a database table for it that's storing modifications. And then what does that natural language through to like the modification system, like what does that actually look like? How does this change our recipe generation pipeline in general? Okay, how do we actually validate it? And again, we're getting into like the prompt engineering side of things. We need to look at flavor compatibility, texture, cooking methods, chemical interactions. I think that's pretty cool. Dietary conflicts. We'll probably pump this type of stuff up later on, but important to know that this is something we need to look at. Now, the only thing that I want to double check, right? So it's clearly accounting for the user flow where the front end renders those options and a user selects an option specifically. But what I'm not seeing is any explicit instructions around the natural language processing of that user flow. And so I'm just going to ask it to double check back through its complete user flow and add that edge case in there and make sure that edge case is in the plan. So last thing that I'm having it do is I want it to run through the UX agent that we have that we've used a lot in this project. And like, I'm cool with this plan that it has made, but I want to make sure that we have accounted for that in our, like in the UX. I don't want to just say like, okay, now go build it. I want it to be like, okay, this is cool, but now we're like adding some things in that like weren't in the original plan. They solved the problems that have cropped up, but we need to make sure that the way that we're going to implement that front end, at least for it, actually looks good and makes sense. I don't want to just go build it. Going to take one step to refine the idea first, and then we will have it go build the entire thing using the front end agent and the back end agent. Just a small little thing while this is all running in the background. I am doing a little bit of updating to this Claude kind of like markdown file and the memories that we have, because a lot of the time in this app, when we go to build new features, because this is probably going to entail us building a few new things, it almost always messes up the GraphQL implementation. And so I'm starting to go through now and become a little bit more deliberate with how I'm structuring like the memories and what I pass through, and really taking efforts to ensure that the things that have slowed us down in the past are not the things that slow us down in the future. So these, like utilizing these memories over projects like this, when you're doing a lot of like similar type of work, really is a game changer and helps out a lot. For example, what I've added in here is that anytime it goes to build out anything having to do with GraphQL, I want it to reference similar endpoints to understand the patterns that currently work for the app. Because what I found was that it was repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again, and it would inevitably at some point after tons of wasted tokens come to the realization that, hey, I should have just used what already works in this other file. Let me revert everything I just did and just go do that. And it's like, yeah, dude, like you should have done that from the beginning. And so now I'm adding that in as a memory and saying, hey, anytime you go to build anything having to do with GraphQL or creating mutations for it or whatever it is, go look at other stuff already and then follow those patterns. So just a small little workflow thing there that I thought I'd throw in while we're waiting for this other output. All right, so we got our plan here from Claude Code. So we need to first fix the backend. So we'll need to run a database migration so that we can add this parent recipe ID so that we know if something like is a fork off of that original recipe. And then we need to have a recipe modifications table where we can see like what are the modifications that were made to a root parent recipe. So this makes sense. Then we'll need to actually run the migration so that we have the proper database set up like actually there in production. And then that AI chat service that we have that currently powers the app needs to get a little bit more intelligence added into it. So we're going to force JSON responses with the modification options. We're going to support natural language extraction with confidence scoring. We're going to need to track pending modifications versus confirmed modifications. And then we'll need that validation system, which we saw some example functions for, to make sure that what they're trying to do actually makes sense in the context of the original recipe and that we're not completely botching it. So then on the front end, we need to have some UI components around like all of this modification and confirmation cards and all of that. And so it's breaking down the main stuff. So it's saying, hey, based on the app design principles, it actually makes sense to have little chips instead of these big cards for how we show modifications. So again, I think that makes sense. That's why we ran this UX agent in the first place. Floating modifications badge. I have this thing against floating UI components because it can feel very cluttered if it's not done well. And so I'm okay with this if it makes sense in the context of where it builds it. It's saying that it's going to be in the bottom right above the chat input. So right on this screen, it would be like kind of right here, I guess is what it's saying. And when it gets clicked, it expands to show all the modifications. So that could be cool. And then the confirmation card component. So if you have a natural language type of selection and it's like less than 80% score, Like, are we going to choose like accept or reject, or like what is that going to actually look like? Then we have like how the state's going to be managed and what the overall user flow looks like. And then for phase 2 in the future, a few other things that we could do. So that's all well and good. And so I'm going to say yes, proceed with phase 1 specifically. Proceed. So we'll say add phase 2 to the backlog via linear MCP, and then proceed to phase 1. All right, guys, so we're going to give this thing a whirl. So we'll go into one of these recipes like this one. Say we want to refine it with AI. Create a new chat over here. Refine with AI. Okay, and so we can see we have a recipe pulled up in here. And so now let's say that instead of halibut, we wanted to use a different fish. So say based on the recipe, find me a different main protein fish. Okay, that's going to go out. It's going to think about it for a second, and then it returns to us a few different options. So we could say, hey, we like the sea bass, for example. But then let's say that there's other stuff we wanted to change, and we said something like, what can we do instead of the, other ingredient? Okay, have it go back out and pull some other ingredient suggestions. Okay, now it went through and found a bunch of other stuff, so we could pick this one too. So now that we have a few of these picked out, we could come down here and click this little icon. And so this is saying, okay, you're substituting halibut for sea bass and the nori for the dulse. And now we can choose to actually generate a recipe variation based on that. So a small little thing that will change in the next video or tweak in the next video is that it doesn't give us like an animation. There's no loading state showing us that this is in fact processing in the background. So eventually it's just going to pop up and say, hey, your recipe's done. Boom, just like that. And so we could continue the chat here and kind of read what it said, or we could just pop back. And so now if we were to go into our main screen, we have this new recipe here, this sea bass with a dulce beurre blanc. And then we can go through here and it's now rerun all of that stuff that we had, right? So we have like the flavor profile, the kitchen requirements to be able to cook this thing, nutritional intelligence, success indicators, like how to actually cook this thing properly. All of that type of stuff is now in here. So pretty cool. We have this like kind of first pass where we can kind of go through and have a intelligent conversation with this thing, start a new chat if we want to, just ask it general questions and so on. So this whole chat thing where we can actually refine a recipe is working, and it's just going to become a question of how do we dial it in, make it better and better and better and more accurate. All right, guys, so we've built a decent amount of stuff so far in this video. So let's actually go through and talk about what each of those features were and how they function, okay? What is the tech under the hood that's actually powering them? So first thing we did is we kind of beefed up this kind of core service that we already had a version of where we would generate recipes from OpenAI and like process the images, but we made a lot of enhancements to that system. So like that core service, a lot of changes went down with that. We then put this memory management piece in place. So basically the way this works, when a conversation, so if I'm in here chatting back and forth, if a conversation exceeds 30 messages, basically it's going to compress down that context and summarize it, okay? And then it's going to store that summary into the database as a conversation embedding so that we know exactly and we can refer back to conversations that we've had and what the takeaways from those conversations were. Okay, so we have that endpoint that handles that stuff. We have this vector searching capability. So we're storing all of our recipes into the database, and then we've enabled this ability to search through our past recipes, basically, based on ingredients that were used. Maybe I want to say like, hey, find me all the recipes where we used seaweed in the recipe. So we'll have that capability for everything, for the ingredients, for the cooking methods, for certain dietary preferences, maybe substitutions that were made. All of that is being enabled by this vector search function that we built that we'll go look at some of these just so you can have a bit of a context for what they look like. We then created these like different contexts of what we might be actually wanting to talk about with the system, and it prompts differently based on that. So if I'm in like straight cooking mode It's going to focus more on like step-by-step guidance and not making variations really from the plan. Whereas if I'm in experimentation mode, it's going to be offering a bit more creativity and different variant options and things like that. So we have this little context building system, and then we have a full system that we just tested, which allows us to create modifications. So if I have a specific recipe and I want to substitute out ingredients and things like that, we're able to have that conversation, get intelligent recommendations, and then generate a new recipe from those recommendations. So we have this core like backend chat service architecture that we built out. Then obviously we built all of the front end components for that stuff. So what do the different chat screens look like? We have like a WebSocket integration for real-time communications, the different messaging components and what things actually are like looking like on the front end, how we're managing sessions, all of that type of stuff was built. We made a bunch of changes to our database, right? There's a lot of additional stuff now inside of this database. We have conversation embedding tables. We will eventually have failure pattern embeddings, like what does the user mess up a lot? We'll have embeddings for that. All of our chat messages and chat sessions are being stored. The recipes that we have, the substitutions and the techniques, we'll be building this stuff out later. So we're starting to create tables and have this capability to store all of this stuff that we're doing in our backend database. Then, of course, we needed ways to actually query all of that stuff. So we have this GraphQL API layer that handles this communication. And we have this detailed look at like what are all of the things that we actually changed. So main services that we created, we have this chunking capability. So when a recipe comes through, separating out like the ingredients from the steps and all of that stuff and making it so that we can embed those separately inside of the database and retrieve those later. Same thing with our chats, right? Embedding those chat conversations and the messages that come through. We have this like context building prompt so that we can enable that like context-aware conversations. We have a service that we built that is specifically for our vector searching. So like how do we search for the similarity of a query in the vector database and then return it? So we have an entire service for that we'll go look at in a second. And then we have this main kind of chat service that orchestrates everything. So let's go look at some of these things in a little bit of detail. So this is what it looks like in practice, this actual class that we built on the back end. So we have this AI chef chat service, which basically has access to all of those things we talked about. So it has access to all the chat memory that we have, right? So all the different chats that have happened in the embeddings and all that type of stuff, it has access to all of those. It has access to this function that can build the prompt context depending on the view that the person is in. Are they in cooking mode? Are they in experimenting mode? What mode are they in? We have different prompts that get built and get sent through that OpenAI service depending on, again, what the person's trying to do. In that, we have this vector search service, which I'll show you guys in a second. And then we have this ability to actually chunk everything up and use it. And so a bunch of Python code, but we can actually go look just for an example at that vector search service. So here's an example of what something like this is going to look like. So we have this search similar recipes function. So imagine if I'm on the front end here and I'm having a chat or I'm in maybe the cookbook and I want to make a search and I have tons of recipes in here and I want to like find where we've cooked with mussels before, okay? We would call this endpoint to search similar recipes, and then we can look through and see how this would work. So the first thing that happens is actually you need to convert the user's question or query into an embedding. So if I'm saying, find me a recipe where we used mussels, it's going to create an embedding for that, okay? The reason it does that is then it can look at all of the embeddings it has, right? All of the recipes we've made and the ingredients that were used and all of that type of stuff. And it can see like, okay, we have this person asking for a recipe in mussel, and that matches mathematically with this thing we have stored over here that seems to indicate recipe and mussel. So it's going to match those two things. And so first thing we do is we generate an embedding for the actual question that is being asked. And then what we do here is we make the SQL query to find that like similarity basically. So we take the embedding, like the query embedding, and the SQL saying, hey, we want to go through, you want to select the recipe ID from this recipe embeddings table that we have, okay, over here. So we're basically saying, look through this, where is it, recipe embeddings table, for the recipe ID. I want you to return me the recipe ID. And then it's saying where chunk type is title, right? So we have this column called chunk type, which is title. And so it's going to go through and it's going to look for all of the recipe titles, at least, that match my query embedding. Now, obviously, this is something we'd probably want to update because depending on the way the person searches for it, it might make more sense to look for example, the actual ingredients that were used, okay? In the context of like our app and what it actually is, it would make sense if a user's asking for a recipe where we made mussels to maybe look through the actual ingredients that would have that. Okay, so we might need to make some adjustments to the logic, but we have the same thing for a lot of different pieces of the app. So we can do just like a basic find similar recipes, but another option, if we had a big table of common substitutions, we could search through for that too. So if the user says like, hey, I need to substitute my butter because I'm vegan, it would have a intelligent lookup table where it can say, hey, they're trying to substitute this thing. What are the matching substitutions we have? Okay, we can give them like a vegan butter, or depending on the recipe, like olive oil or whatever it might be. So we have a bunch of different functionality for like searching things based on their meaning that is powered by this vector search service. So if we were to go back now and look at what did we intend to integrate into this app as far as AI features go, this is basically the one that we built. Again, it was a placeholder when we first started. There was nothing here for that. There was a lot of groundwork that had to go on in the background to make it ready and make it relevant for our app. So all of that stuff we built with, again, the vector database stuff we were just looking at, and all of the other interaction to be able to intelligently prompt and all of that stuff was basically just to power these two features. That being said, we built out a lot of the infrastructure already for these other pieces, right? So like the smart recipe recommendations, for example, are going to use those similarity vectors that we had. So we're just going to need to add a few other pieces in to really power all of this stuff. For example, we already have the system to do the embedding for failed recipes. So a user can say like, hey, this recipe totally botched and the sauce broke and I couldn't eat it. So we have the system, the pipeline already in place to be able to embed that stuff. We just need to go through in the next stage and start utilizing all of these features that were built in the app. So everything from the experiment mode features to the cookbook mode where we can go through, and actually search. So if we were to search this, it uses that vector search to find like recipes that used mussels, for example. So a few other little tiny things that we're going to need to put in there. Scaling, the difficulty, things like that. But that should be pretty straightforward for us to do in the next video. So that's it for this video, guys. If you want to see those other AI features specifically being built, that walkthrough tutorial will be available for free inside of the school group below this video. Now, in the next video that we get into, it's going to be all about how we polish this app. Because at the end of the day, we have features and functionality that are cool and the thing works, but there's still a lot of optimization that needs to be done, particularly in a few areas. Number one, the overall user experience and UI. It's really not that good, what we've built so far. And so we're going to go through and show how we can take an existing app and really pump it up and polish it so that it looks a lot better and feels a lot better. So that's the first major thing. Second major thing, performance optimizations are going to be really big. So how can we make sure that like the interaction and movement between these screens are really snappy and fast? Number three, making sure that the initial requirements that we set out to build with the app in our first video are actually being met and that we haven't missed any like really critical things that we were supposed to build for this MVP, that there's nothing really important, again, that slipped through the cracks. But as far as this video, we covered off on some really cool stuff, how we can use this concept of a vector database to enable similarity searching, meaning we want to have this intelligent chatbot where we can have conversations with it and it knows other stuff that we've done before. If I ask it, hey, have we made fish before and what failures did we have? I want to avoid those this time. It can go have an intelligent query to find that stuff in a database and return us things that are relevant to what we're actually asking, okay? That was all powered by a vector database, but in order to get it into the vector database, we needed to chunk the data properly, okay? So we got into our chunking services and building those things out, which was awesome because it was done entirely by Claude Code, right? All we had to do was go through and read it afterwards and make sure that it made sense for what we are trying to build. But with all of this generation of things and embeddings and all that, we need to make sure that our memory management is on point and that we're not just keeping these really, really big tables needlessly, and that we have systems in place to be able to compress that stuff down and archive things that the user's realistically not probably going to need to access. Once we had all of that type of stuff in place, it came down to, well, how do we use all of that to engineer our prompts the best way so that we can send the best prompts possible to OpenAI to get out all of the outputs that we need for our app to function. So by the end of the video, we had this really intelligent pipeline where we can store important information, we can retrieve important information, but most importantly, we can inject that information into the prompts that we end up sending to the language model, again, so that we get out the things that we need in order to push our app forward. And that is inevitably what powered our ability to do these intelligent substitutions and build this really simple but pretty cool AI chat system that is our little cooking companion. So like I said, if you want to see me go build all of those other AI features that we were talking about, I will be doing that inside of the free school group that you can get access to below. And that is where we have all of the prompts, all of the agents that we use, all the templates, everything we do on this channel is stored in there. So if you want to see video 3, make sure you're subscribed so that you get notified when the next video goes up. But that's it for this one. We'll see you in the next video.